Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump to a specific point in the video, you can mouse over or tap on the screen in the video playback area, and then see the video timeline where you will see chapter titles to the different sections of the video, which will allow you to jump right to that point. So this week I have a couple of tidbits. I want to tell you about my trip to Michigan this past week where I picked up some family heirlooms. And then I want to talk about some suggestions and comments I had about this sweater I talked about last week that I am reverse engineering. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about my YouTube channel and the relationship between my technique videos and my Casual Friday podcasts. So let's get started. So the first tidbit I wanted to talk to you about is a knitting podcast that's called Show and Tell Knits. And it's by a woman who watches my channel and participates in my group, but she also, I've seen her in the All Things Vintage group on Ravelry as well. So she's very interested in vintage clothing and vintage jewelry and that whole aesthetic of that. And so her new podcast is focused on that and on interviewing people and showing off and telling about their vintage items as well. So I will leave a link down in the video description in case you are interested in that. She just got started with it this summer and I know she'd love to have some more subscribers. So I thought you guys might be interested. I think I mentioned something about in the past few weeks when I talked about my yarn reorganization, and I talk about my yarn stash, and I have 6 sweaters worth of worsted weight yarn, for example. And somebody wanted to know, what does that mean? What is a sweater's worth of yarn? And buying yarn where I don't know what sweater I'm going to knit with it, or I know what sweater I'm going to knit, but I don't have a pattern for it, and I have to try to figure out how much yarn I'm going to need. I use a few different approaches. So for sweaters, because I knit so many sweaters and most of them are in worsted weight yarn, I have a pretty good idea of the range of amount of yarn that I'm going to need. Sort of really know that the minimum is going to be 600 grams of worsted weight yarn that's in a put up of 20 or 200 meters or 220 yards. I know that's going to be the minimum that I will need. And the maximum I'm probably going to need, if I'm knitting something, say for my husband, which is not very common, and it's going to be heavily cabled, then at the most I'm probably going to need is 1,000 grams of yarn at the same amount. I have that kind of sense of it's between 600 grams and 1,000 grams, and it really depends on the complexity and the size of the sweater. So for myself, if I'm knitting a cardigan that's extra long, maybe it has pockets in it and maybe a shawl collar, these things are going to take more yarn, so I know I'm going to need the higher end of that yarn range. If I'm designing something for myself and trying to predict how much yarn I'm going to need, I try to look for similar garments on Ravelry, or I look in my own projects to see exactly how much did I use of a given yarn to give me a good estimate. And I always round up. I always get more than I think I'm going to need. I don't mind having leftovers, especially in worsted weight yarn. Sometimes I'm knitting something like a blanket, which it's pretty easy to design a blanket and figure out what you want to do for that and how wide you want to make it, how many stitches it's going to take to make it that wide. But I'm not good at necessarily predicting how much yarn in total I'm going to need. So again, I will go look on Ravelry at projects that were blanket projects that were made from that yarn weight and look at the stitch patterns. I want to compare similar stitch patterns like garter stitch or cables or things like that to kind of get a sense of how much yarn. And again, I round up. And in those kinds of situations, when I'm planning something where there's nobody else dictating how much yarn I'm going to need, I try to start those projects as soon as I can after I get the yarn. And I take a look at how far I get with the first couple of balls of yarn. As I've mentioned many times on this channel, I always create a spreadsheet before I start a project, and I calculate the total number of stitches I think I'm going to have in this particular project, so that when I use up the first ball of yarn and the second ball of yarn, I can see what percentage of the way I am through the project. And I can predict whether or not I'm going to have enough yarn. And so for things like a blanket, where in some ways it doesn't matter if you end up short or not, if you really want it to be long enough, you want to make sure that you have enough yarn to do that. If I'm looking at where I am in the project, I'm a couple of skeins into the project and I think I am not going to have enough yarn, I order more. If I ordered it online, or go back to the yarn shop, and they almost always still have the same dye lot in stock. Some yarn shops have a return policy on yarn that only extends for like 90 days. So if you wait to start your project, then you find out you have a ton left over and you don't want it, you want to return it. You can't do that if it's past the 60 days or 90 days or whatever that shop has set as their policy. So that's why I start this project right away and see how far I'm going to get with the first couple of balls of yarn. And then I will know, oh, I way overbought, or oh no, I'm not going to have enough and I can get more. And like I said, with me, I don't care if I have extra. I'll find something to use it for. But that's my approach. I look at other projects and I look at my past history. So there's some yarn weights and some types of projects that I don't have a ton of experience with, and it really helps me just to look at Ravelry projects and see how other people have done this. So I got a comment on a Casual Friday video that I made a couple of years ago. I'll link to it up here. And in that video, I was talking about taking a class on Latvian mittens. So the comment was that the person was really surprised that I would be taking a knitting class, but they suppose it's possible to learn something new, whatever you do. So I want to talk about why I take knitting classes. The reason you might take a knitting class could be very different from the reasons that I would take a knitting class. But let me just tell you why I would take a knitting class. Number one is when I started teaching knitting classes, I had never taken a knitting class, so I didn't know what knitting classes even looked like. I had taught other types of workshops and classes, so I was comfortable with teaching, but I'd never seen anybody else teach knitting, and so I didn't know what that looked like. So I had the opportunity to take a knitting class a few months later when I was in Michigan visiting my mother. So I was looking at what yarn shop was in Ludington, where she lives, and I saw that they were going to have this all-weekend workshop with a pretty big name in knitting design, and teaching was going to be teaching all weekend there. And I thought, oh, great, I can combine my trip to visit my mom along with taking this knitting class from this well-known designer. And I thought it'd be really interesting to see how she taught, like to watch her teach. And I was teaching small classes in a yarn shop. I was teaching like 6 people at a time, maybe, and 8 at the most, but usually pretty small, 4 to 6 people. And this was going to be a class of 20. So that was interesting to me. Is like, how do you do that? How do you teach to 20 people? So I was taking her classes because she was a well-known teacher and she was teaching a larger class. And I wanted to see, how did that work? Oftentimes, that is why I take a knitting class, is because it's a well-known teacher, somebody who I admire or I've heard good things about, and I just want to watch them teach. Sometimes I'm in an environment where I need to speak to a larger group, and I just want to see that approach versus the very small, intimate group approach that you have sitting around a table in a yarn shop. I was doing the Master Hand Knitting program when I started teaching. I was about halfway through the second level. I was kind of on a hiatus from that second level when I started teaching, but I had finished the first level, and I knew that coming up in the third level, there were certain types of stitch patterns that we would be expected to demonstrate, that we would have to submit swatches. And the Master Hand Knitting program is all about showing that you have mastered a technique. So you learn a lot while you're taking the program. You're not showing them what you learned, you're showing them what you've mastered. And so I knew that there were going to be some things that I hadn't done before in level 3, and investigating them and looking at them, they were like, these are not things that I am looking forward to learning about and really want to dive into and learn all about, like Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns, immediately I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I mean, I learned about those stitch patterns from the Master Hand Knitting program, and I was diving into them and buying books and knitting stitch patterns with them. I loved those. Double knitting was not something I was particularly interested in doing. I think it's interesting. I liked the results, but it's not something that I was like super interested in learning. And entrelac was another one where I really wasn't interested in. Entrelac is a type of modular knitting, and even though I like the results of modular knitting, I don't enjoy it. It's not something that I like. So for those two techniques, I knew that I'd have to really know what I was doing when I was doing those swatches. So I chose to take classes on those from people who are known experts on those topics, because I thought I would be taught the best practices. I could ask any question about that topic that I could think of, and they would probably have an answer for it. And I would probably learn more than I needed to know in order to knit the swatch for the Master Hand Knitting program, which is a good thing, that I would know more about the technique than what I had to demonstrate. So I took a double knitting class, an all-day double knitting class from Lucy Neatby, which was amazing. She had a DVD on the topic. I bought that so that I have that as a reference material. And then our local guild does an annual knitting conference thing called Yarn Over. We bring in like 15 different teachers nationally all over. And a woman I had befriended on Ravelry named Joan Schrouder was coming to Yarn Over and teaching entrelac. So I was going to get to meet Joan in person. I was going to get to take a class from her, and we were planning to go to breakfast with Tech Knitter, who is from Wisconsin. The three of us were all going to go to breakfast. So it was like going to be a really fun weekend for me. Plus, I'd get to take the entrelac class from Joan. Those are the kinds of reasons that I would typically take a knitting class. The reason I took the Latvian knitting class a couple of years ago was different. So at the beginning of 2018, I'd been teaching Technique Tuesday videos for a year. The yarn shop where I'd been teaching up through 2016 closed at the end of the year, so I wasn't teaching in person anymore. And I was doing weekly technique videos for a year, and I found that I really missed seeing knitters in person. My knitting groups had kind of dissolved that I'd been a member of in the previous years, so I wasn't seeing my knitting group at all. And I wasn't going to very many knitting guild meetings because those were on Tuesdays, and a lot of times I was still working on my videos well into Tuesday evening. It took a lot longer to get those videos processed with the equipment we had and the internet connection we had and all of that. So I wasn't getting to go to very many knitting guild meetings, and I really missed knitters. So one of the things that I decided to do in 2018 was to get myself out in the knitting community and to make sure that I was going to as many guild meetings as I could. And it's hard to actually meet people at guild meetings because there's a program, and a lot of instances once a month, a lot of the people who do know each other, that's when they get to see each other. So it's hard to like make connections and actually make friends there. So I decided I was going to volunteer for guild events. So I was going to the guild meetings, I was volunteering for guild events in order to get out in the community. And at one of those guild meetings, somebody stood up and talked about the Latvian mitten class. And I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. And it was in conjunction with Latvian independence, 100th anniversary, and there was a traveling trunk show of all of these Latvian mittens that was at this store called Inga Bretson's. They sell all kinds of Scandinavian things, and they have yarn there, but they also have classes of all different sorts at this location. So I went to Inga Bretson's to look at the Latvian mittens that were on display there. And I thought, these are so amazing. They're so different. And I decided to sign up for the class because I thought it would be interesting to learn about the history and the cultural significance of Latvian mittens from somebody who was born in Latvia and was teaching the class. I knew that I could knit a pair of Latvian mittens without taking a class. I knew how to knit mittens. I knew how to knit stranded color work. That was not why I was taking the class. It was to get myself out in the knitting community and learn more context behind Latvian mittens. And so I took that class and it was amazing. I never finished my Latvian mittens from that class. I wasn't really that interested in actually making the Latvian mittens. It wasn't about the mittens. But I learned so much about the cultural context of those mittens in that class. The knitting teacher wasn't really much of a knitting teacher. She was Latvian and she knew about the mittens and she could knit them, but it wasn't really a big thing for her. She was the person in the local community who was available and able to teach the class. But I had a lot of questions that came up from all of the things that I learned and from the other students in the class. And it took me on a path of research and learning that is much deeper and extensive than any other knitting class I have taken. And again, I never finished those mittens. So there's lots of reasons to take knitting classes, and learning the specific thing that that teacher is teaching is only one of those reasons. So that's why I take knitting classes. So this past week, I drove out to Michigan to visit my mother. This was a trip that I'd hoped to take last spring, but obviously got canceled. And I spent the summer trying to figure out when was going to be a good time to go see her and how was I going to get there. Typically, I go in the summer, sometime between the spring and the fall, the best time for me to get to Michigan because just the traveling is a lot easier. She lives in Ludington, Michigan, which is right on Lake Michigan. I talked about a trip I took to Ludington a couple of years ago with my daughter and kind of explained all of the different ways that you can get to Ludington from where I live in the Twin Cities. I'll leave a link to that video up there. But typically, I would drive directly east from the Twin Cities all the way across the neighboring state of Wisconsin until I hit Lake Michigan and got to a town called Manitowoc. And there I would board a car ferry, and it would take 4 hours to get across Lake Michigan, and it would land in Ludington and would be a couple miles from my mother's house. So there are a couple of issues with doing that this year, and namely I was trying to minimize any contact that I would have with anybody on my way from my house to my mother's house, especially since I was on my way to visit my elderly mother and her elderly husband. I didn't want to risk anything. The best solution for me was to drive around the bottom of Lake Michigan and up to Ludington. So if everything is perfect, it's 10 hours of driving time. If the weather is okay, but the traffic is not so great, if there's construction or accidents or just traffic, you can add another hour to that. I have a daughter who lives in Chicago now, and she lives just 1 mile off the interstate. And so I was able to drive 6 hours down to Chicago, get off the interstate, go to her apartment. We were able to sit on her balcony and eat lunch. And I was able to pick up a sweater that I had started knitting for her last winter, had mailed to her to try on. I mailed it to her place of business the day before they declared everybody was going to have to work from home, and it arrived at her place of business the day after she started working at home. So it stayed at her workplace from March until July. That was the first time she went back to her workplace, and she's only there once or twice every couple of weeks. So she finally got the sweater in July, brought it home, we did a FaceTime, she tried it on, we talked about the added measurements, and she never mailed it back to me. I dropped off some things that we'd been holding on for her, and she gave me the sweater, and then it was another 4 hours on the highway to get to my mother's house. And so I was able to completely minimize contact. I made 2 stops at gas stations where nobody was near me, and then the only person I was in contact with was my daughter. We were masked while indoors, and while we were unmasked and eating, we were out on her balcony where there was a pretty stiff breeze. So I was and she is just like we are. We don't go anywhere except maybe the grocery store. Like we're very good about not going out and exposing ourselves. I was pretty confident that I was getting to my mother's house safely and without risking exposure. It's really important for me to visit my mother as soon as I can because she has dementia and she is progressing. So last time I was able to see her in person was a year ago in November, and I can see, I could tell over the phone that things had changed, but I could see that they're getting worse. And if I had waited until next spring, there's no telling if she would recognize me by then. But while I was there, her husband, Al, said to me, "Do you have any interest in your grandmother's dishes?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "I don't even know what they look like. I don't know what they are." He's like, "Oh, we have them in a box." So he brought me out like a little oval platter, or a little oval dish so I could see what they are. And then I'm like, "Oh, I recognize these." And I said, "Well, I know I don't want the whole set, but I'm going to text everybody in the family and see who wants them." So I've been doing genealogy for about 10 years. And so I really like having these pieces of the past, of ancestors. And typically the things that I've acquired since starting doing genealogy do not have much intrinsic value. One of the things I've learned about having these kinds of pieces from doing genealogy and going to conferences and stuff is that if you have these things, don't keep them closed up in a closet somewhere. If it's important for you to have this, do something with it in some way. Find a way to be able to use the item or to at least display it so that you can see it and so that the other family members see it and understand what it is, instead of keeping it in a box in a closet and then when you die, they don't have any idea what this is. It doesn't mean anything to them, and they have no idea what the connection is to the past. So I have some things. I have something from my father's mother that he sent to me that I have struggled to figure out what to do with, and it's like a cigar box. And what she kept in it were all of these things like obituaries and things that had to do with family members who died. She got the box because one of her own children died when he was 5. And so in that box is an envelope of a lock of his hair from his first haircut, the hairnet she wore at his funeral, the bill for the funeral, like all of these like things that just wrench your heart. But it's a physical object. And I've struggled to try to figure out what to do with it. I have it in a box of other things, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with it. So that's been put away for a while. And I've been thinking about my grandmother's dishes and what I would want out of all this collection. My brother's family would like little pieces. On my way back from Michigan, when I stopped to see Sophia again, she wanted some small plates. And so I gave her 3. She's got 2 roommates, so I'll take three little plates. She would like to have them. She thinks they're pretty, and it's nice to have that. But again, she wants to have something she can use. And I've been thinking about what of those pieces would I want. And I know what my brother's family wants. And in some ways, I don't even really care which pieces they are. But I've been trying to figure out what I would do with them. Would I put them in my china cabinet and not use it? Would I put it in my everyday dishes and try to use it in some way? Or would I put it on display? And so I'm thinking that I'm going to get some sort of a little plate stand or something and have a plate on display, or maybe a teacup and saucer and try to make an effort to drink tea out of one of the cups or something like that. So a few years back, when Sophia, my daughter, lives in Chicago, when she was in college out in Boston, I wanted to do a genealogy trip to New York and look up some documents that were not available online at the time. And during all of my genealogical research on his side of the family, I was able to discover that his mother's aunt was still alive. She's now in her early 90s. She was in her late 80s then. She was far younger than all her siblings. So my mother-in-law's mother was the oldest. She still lives in the house where she grew up and where my mother-in-law's mother grew up. And so I stopped to visit her, and she gave me a tour of the house and the neighborhood and was showing where all of the different families and cousins and aunts and uncles lived in the neighborhood. So I was sitting in Teresa's living room and talking to her and going through photos and talking about various things. And she offered me this mantle clock that was sitting on top of her television. It doesn't work anymore, but it was a clock that had belonged to her mother. So it was a clock that had been in that house for 100 years. And it was the clock that my husband's grandmother, my mother-in-law's mother, would have known and seen every day while she was growing up. So it was this connection to the past. It was so unexpected, and I was like, I couldn't believe she was offering it to me. And I was able to fit it into my suitcase and brought it home. And I put it on a shelf in our living room. And then there was this little story about how my husband's grandmother, when she was young and she promised to be home by a certain time, would turn the clock back an hour or so. So that it would look like when she got home that she got home on time, but she'd really stayed out late. So there's a cute little story that's associated with it, and it's been sitting on the shelf. So I've been thinking about my grandmother's dishes, and I could display them on a shelf next to that clock as well, which then made me realize that I can find some way to display my other grandmother's, my paternal grandmother's little box of treasures. That is this physical item that I have of hers, that I could find some way to display that on a shelf. So that was my trip to Michigan. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the comments and suggestions I got regarding this sweater that I talked about last week. So last week I kind of showed you my approach to starting out the process of reverse engineering a beloved sweater. And so I showed you how I measured, how I did gauge swatches, and I also told you my ideas about some changes that I wanted to make. So one of the things that I mentioned about reverse engineering is that there's kind of a spectrum of reverse engineering. And one end of the spectrum is that you are trying to replicate something exactly and down to the stitch count. So that means you're using the exact same yarn weight that the original had, and you are counting stitches and you are creating everything exactly. And I've done that before from photographed items and figured out what yarn was being used. And then used a yarn weight that was identical and counted stitches and figured out stitch patterns and replicated the original item. The other end of the spectrum is seeing something you really like and then just making something that kind of is reminiscent of that item. You're not trying to replicate it exactly, but you want something that gives you the same sort of feel as the original. So that would be the other end. What I'm planning with this is something in the middle. Because my original idea, I had two sweaters in mind originally. One was to replicate this. The other was that I had some yarn that I wanted to use. I had dyed some yarn at a retreat, a single skein, and I wanted to use that in a sweater that had cables. And some of the cables, I would use that red yarn. And I didn't know what sweater. I'd kind of looked at existing patterns, didn't see anything I liked, and couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to design. But those were the two different ideas. I had the yarn for that sweater. I bought some gray yarn to go with that red skein that I had dyed myself. So it is not the same yarn weight as this, which means that I'm making a couple of changes right off the bat when I decided to combine those two ideas. One is I'm not using the same yarn weight. I'm using something that's sort of very similar, slightly thinner, but it means I have to do more stitches and I have to make other kinds of modifications. What I do want to maintain is the silhouette of the sweater. And I want to use this type of cable because I really like this cable and I wanted to figure out how to knit that cable. So, but I am making some changes because some of these cables are going to be red. And so last week I was saying, well, you know, one of the ideas, there are a lot of ways you could employ some extra color in this. And one of my ideas was to knit one cable on the back that was red and not have it be the one up the center. It'd be either to the left or to the right. And then if I had, whichever side I did the red cable, then I would use a sleeve that was further away from that, and I would do one of those cables in red, thinking I'd probably do the center cable, maybe. I don't know. You know, I didn't know. Well, a couple of people had suggestions. And so I wanted to talk through about how you go from your original sort of big picture idea for something when you have ideas for modifications or even for an original design where here's my idea, here's what I'd like to do. And then what happens when you start actually trying to figure out how can I execute my idea. So one of the ideas that somebody had was that whichever cable I made red on the back, that I made the matching cable on, I did a front cable that would meet it at the shoulder. That was my original idea as well, and I kind of have discounted that. And here's why. Because the idea that I was saying last week was that I wouldn't do a cable on the front that was red, but instead maybe I would do pocket tops that were red. That might be one way to add some red to the front. And people are saying, oh no, but you should have the, cables be red up to the top. And that, I agree, that would be really cool. So here's the problem. I don't know if, can you see right here what's going on? So this pocket extends across the front of one of these cables and then only part way across the other one. There's 3 stitches on the edge here where it doesn't come across. So if I were to do one of these cables, if I were to do this one in red, I'd have red here and then I'd have red coming up the side here. And I don't think I want that. So then you have to figure out, well, is there some other additional modification I could make so that that would work? Like, could I make the pocket wider? Well, it'd be another 1/2 inch wider. Do I want a pocket that's that wide, that's kind of wide? Or can I leave this like this? You don't really notice it when this is all in gray. You don't realize that it's doing that. What if you made this one in red? Well, then you'd have red coming up here for this first part of the cable. It would be interrupted with the gray, and then you'd have red coming up there. Maybe that'll work. It's a possibility, but I just don't know. It's something I have to tinker with. One of the things that's different about the front than is true of the back is that there's a lot more going on the front. So there's just a lot more going on. And does the addition of the color add to it, make it worse, or have sort of a neutral effect on it? I don't know. So if I were to do a cable on the front, it would probably be this one over here on the left that comes up here and then comes back up. That's probably which one I would do. And then it would meet up here at the shoulder. Well, somebody else had an idea about, what you should do is, the cables that are closest to the sides, have those be red, and then the one up the middle can come up and meet those 2 cables. They could all intersect. And the problem is that they don't touch already up here, that there is a span of purl stitches that would separate that. So if I did that, they wouldn't meet. So, and then you have the problem of the bottom here where the red would be coming around the outside of the pocket. So there are some challenges with trying to make that work. And so then you have to decide, well, am I going to be a slave to how this layout was originally done, or would I modify that in some way? So these are all the kinds of things that you have to think about when you are making these modifications, or if you're just designing something from scratch. Sometimes the idea that you have doesn't actually, that's not going to work, but could I make it work if I shifted something else? So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do at this point. And then there was another suggestion people had. Some people are really bugged by the fact that these cables are not mirrored on the front, and what they would want to do was have the cables mirrored. And that was initially something that I wanted as well, because I prefer having things mirrored. And you can mirror these because you have this center business right here. The front of the sweater is interrupting those 2 halves. And you could mirror them. And one thing that I would like to do, let's see if you can see this. After this crossing right here, the stockinette narrows all the way up, that if I were going to mirror them, I would continue the crossings even as they narrowed. That would be something that I would probably want to do. But here's the issue with mirroring the cables, and that is you can't really do that on the back because you don't have something interrupting the center. These cables are all the same. And the only way to mirror the sleeves, these crossing to the right and everything on this half crossing to the left, but then on the back, you have to make a decision. You know, these are just considerations that you have to think about. And so, you know, one of the ideas that I had, all the gray cables crossing to the right as they are, and that wherever I put a red cable, I would have that cross to the left instead. And if I did that, and if I had the red cable be the one that was closest to the button band, so it didn't get interrupted on the side here, in that case, I might instead choose to do it over on this side, and so that I would have this one going in the opposite direction, and then I could make these two cables mirrored relative to each other because one would be red, and then I'd have the one on the back that matched, that met up with that one at the shoulder be red. So that's something that I would consider. I kept thinking, oh, I'd put the red one over here for some reason. But if I put it over here instead, then I could mirror that particular one next to the V-neck. So I appreciate the suggestions. They certainly, you know, it's like going through all of those suggestions again, many of which were ideas I'd had and kind of tossed to the side, but having a slightly different take on it, or hearing somebody nudge me with that idea that they also think that that's a good idea, to make me reconsider it again is really nice. So thank you for your comments and suggestions. I appreciate it. So I want to talk about the connection between my technique videos and my Casual Friday videos. So frequently in my Casual Friday videos, I'll be talking about the projects I'm working on, and sometimes it's modifications or sometimes it's designs, and I'm just kind of talking out loud about what I'm doing. Sometimes I do some overheads to kind of give you a concept of the process for what I'm doing. And if there's a technique video that's associated with what I'm talking about, I'll refer to it and I'll link to it at the top. My technique videos are not just demonstrations of how do you do a technique. I want it to be clear to people how and why the technique works. And if there's another technique that does something similar, what that technique might be and what the advantages and disadvantages of each technique might be in a given circumstance, like when might you use this technique versus when might you use that technique. The idea is that you can understand more about how knitting works, so that if you are working on a pattern that calls for a specific technique, that you don't have to necessarily do things that way, that you could choose to do it a slightly different way. You could choose to make a different choice for yourself. Or if you're making a modification and you need to add a technique that isn't in the existing pattern, or if you're in the beginning phases of learning to design for yourself, how do you pick a technique and what technique do you pick and where do you place it and that sort of thing. So that is my goal with my technique videos, to teach you more about how knitting works, not just what are the instructions in order to produce this particular result. That to me is not as useful as understanding more about how and why knitting works. My Casual Friday podcast, when I'm talking about my projects, I'm often modifying something, or like with the vintage patterns, they're only in one size, and there's a lot that I have to try to figure out about these patterns, and I usually pick something that I think is going to be really hard, specifically because I want that challenge. But I just kind of walk you through that process of how I'm approaching things and why I'm doing different things. And I'm often not giving you step-by-step directions. I might give you an overview of something and how I approached doing one thing versus another, but I'm probably not giving step-by-step instructions for that. So the point here is that I'm showing how a technique and why a technique works in my technique videos. And then in my Casual Friday videos, I'm showing you real life application of those techniques in a project where I'm making a modification, or I'm making a change, or I'm designing something, or I'm thinking, or I'm thinking about why I might use this technique versus using this other technique, and so that I have control over my knitting and I can get the result that I want, rather than being a slave to the pattern and not knowing how to change something that I don't like. Because one of the things that I used to be really frustrated by when I was a slave to the pattern was I would knit a pattern that had a really great technique, say for shoulder shaping. And I would think, this is really cool and I love the result. And then the next pattern I would make would be in a different size for a different person. It would have in a different yarn with different stitch counts. And it would have the shoulder shaping done in a very different way that I didn't like. And I would think, I wish I could use this other technique in this pattern, but I wouldn't understand how to make that happen. And so that is what I'm hoping I am teaching you guys. And I would like some feedback on maybe how I could make that connection clearer or more direct. It's only the first time I've really thought about it this specifically, so I'm really looking for your thoughts on this. So anything you want to leave down in the comments would be great. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.